Okay, I'd like to officially welcome everyone this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by stating that this presentation is sponsored by the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program as part of the Challenging Racism at UF series. It is the last of the public programs in the series, and it is also sponsored by a grant by the UF Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere. This work would not have been possible without that support by the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere at UF. So with no further ado, I'd like to just say that, this is the culmination of a semester-long journey. The Challenging Racism at UF Public Program series has looked at a variety of subjects, activism on UF's campus and off by students, by faculty members, historical subjects that had to do with Gainesville and sort of the African American community in Gainesville and the ways in which they resisted racism, again, both at UF and off campus, and just sort of the systemic racism and the ways in which it impacted the community of Gainesville and the UF campus more generally. So to sort of end the series, we're going to take a look at a pilot project that began last year, sort of as an idea that I had regarding my own research. And what we're going to do is sort of introduce that research briefly. I will then talk about major themes that this pilot project that I'm going to present to you identified. And then we're going to talk about next steps for the White Anti-Racist Activist Digital History Project at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. So with no further ado, I'd like to begin by sort of introducing myself and introducing the motivations and inspirations for the project. I'm a first-gen PhD student that graduated last year, so a recent graduate. In May of last year, I received my degree from the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law. And since then, I've been sort of working on expanding the work that I did as part of my dissertation, and this project emerged from the broader impacts of that dissertation work. In doing the work that I did as part of my dissertation, I realized that some of that work was directly impactful in the ways in which whiteness is socially constructed, and understanding the social construction of whiteness, also understanding the entanglements between whiteness and white supremacy, and ultimately sort of the broader impacts of decoupling those two identities and ideologies from one another. That was the main thrust of my work, my dissertation, and it's now the main thrust of a book manuscript draft that I'm working on. And this project is tangential to that work because in many ways, I'm very interested still in understanding the social construction of whiteness and the social construction of white supremacy, and I'm particularly interested in decoupling one from the other. So this is a pilot project. It is looking at whiteness in the Gulf South, and specifically the ways in which that whiteness expresses itself as part of anti-racist activism in the Gulf South. So anything related to the ways in which individuals who self-identify as white or can be externally categorized as white, participating in movements that try to oppose, reverse, and end white supremacy as an ideology, as a reality in U.S. society, in which it has been dominant for the breadth of U.S. history and into the present. So, in looking at the topic itself, it's, motivated and inspired by research and scholarship that has emerged over the course of many decades, in the previous century and this century as well, and researchers trying to define what whiteness is and sort of tracing its historical origins, tracing also the historical origins of white supremacy and racialization, and the ways in which African Americans have been racialized in this country, and sort of how whiteness played a role in that process, played a role in their oppression, played a role in the emergence of also activism against white supremacy. So those are the theoretical motivations for the project. As far as the research question is concerned, I'm interested in the ideological and practical characteristics of white anti-racist activism in the Gulf South for this particular pilot project. So what motivates individuals who self-identify or can be externally categorized as white to take part and to find ways to oppose white supremacy in practice. So that was the idea behind this project and sort of the main research question. And as far as data and methodology was concerned, what I decided to do was follow existing scholarship in trying to ascertain the ways in which activists on the ground are involved in the decoupling, really, of whiteness from white supremacist whiteness, in ways in which those two are not related, and in what role does social justice activism play in decoupling those two ideologies and those two identities from one another. So I utilized oral histories as a methodology, and in the social sciences, what we refer to as in-depth semi-structured interviews, and also descriptive coding of those interviews using Atlas TI. And that, if you're familiar with that methodology, it's basically taking transcripts, taking audio, and coding it to identify major themes, and then sort of drawing upon those codes to establish patterns and ultimately find ways and find connections and network those connections between interviews. So it's a qualitative methodology, and that's the primary method and data that is used for this project. It is a pilot project. So for the time being, only 5 interviews have been conducted, and there are plans to expand that work in this coming summer. I'll talk more about that in the next steps section of the presentation. But that sort of, is a good introduction to the data and methods that were used. So in those 5 interviews, 2 males, we had representation of 2 males, 2 females, and 1 non-binary individual. They were all aged 60 to 85 and located in specific areas of the Gulf South. We had to sort of make sure that we met the stipulations of the grant that was provided to us by the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere at UF. So Palatka, Florida, and Gainesville, Florida, those were the primary locations because those were the locations we committed to in the grant. And then we also had the opportunity to interview folks in Holly Springs, Mississippi, outside of sort of the grant stipulations, but relevant to the work that this project is interested in. So that's sort of a respondent profile. And now what I'd like to do is go over some of the major themes that were identified. So one of the things we found from these interviews is a discussion about the individuals' ancestors and the ways in which those the identities of their ancestors impacted them personally. And a lot of the questions yielded answers and ideas about the ways in which that process, that transgenerational sort of identity transfer occurred and did not occur. So, this first sort of theme that emerged from the interviews, from the coding the interviews, was that the individuals were, either descendants of migrants and identified as such, or were children of white supremacists. And, we're not shy about identifying that either. So I have two examples here I'd like to present of those two major themes. One is from an individual named Paul, codenamed Paul, whose grandparents escaped from Tsarist Russia to the United States. And the second is offered by Ryan, which I've titled "We Were the Discriminators," and both of those sort of titles will make sense in relation to the main pattern, the theme that we found first.
My mother told me some stories about her side. My mother's family, after the 1905 revolution, they were very active. I don't know if they were Bolsheviks or what, but a Jewish czarist spy ratted them out. What they were doing was they had a little bakery, and they would put leaflets in their loaves of bread, anti-czarist leaflets. So the spy ratted them out, and they killed them. And so they had to leave immediately, and they just escaped.
We'll see in future, in upcoming excerpts. Excuse me. We'll see in upcoming excerpts that that history of opposing authoritarian rule in some way is ingrained in Paul's sort of psyche, in the way that he thinks and the way that he expresses the other themes that we're going to go through. But that is just one example, like I mentioned, this idea of the migration and being the descendant of migrants, and being the descendant of migrants who were involved in opposition to authoritarianism, being salient. And the second one is the second theme rather is that there's, in some ways, there's a connection to white supremacy and the rejection of that white supremacy. So next is Ryan, and sort of his offering of identifying as the descendant of someone who was white supremacist.
We were the discriminators. We didn't experience discrimination. My family came into the northern part of Mississippi in about 1836. And came into Pontotoc County. Pontotoc was the site of the land sales of the U.S. government, selling off all of the lands that they took from the Chickasaws. And so it was a thriving sort of a place that attracted people who wanted to make money. And my great-great-grandfather was a lawyer who had come from South Carolina by way of Selma, Alabama, and he came into Pontotoc along with his dad and cousins, and they bought a bunch of land and had I believe it was 3 fairly large plantations in Pontotoc County, and enslaved people and owned enslaved people. My great grandfather was a circuit judge and traveled throughout North Mississippi as a judge, and was elected to first the State House of Representatives, and then as a state senator. And was a state senator in the year of separation from the Union, and was one of the committee of 12 that drafted the ordinance of separation from the Union. He became the commander of the 42nd Mississippi Infantry, and was wounded fatally at Gettysburg on charge of Cemetery Hill on July 3rd, 1863. My great-grandfather, his son, who was his lieutenant and adjutant, was wounded in that battle, but he survived, and was the one who came back to live outside of Oxford after the war. I guess I should say in that context, that often in confrontations with various white supremacist groups and racist and Klan folks and other folks over the years as we fought in Mississippi, one of the things I've always told them is, you can't out-Confederate me.
So we see there a transition, a transgenerational transition away from that identity of that white supremacist identity. And Ryan will speak more to that in upcoming themes. So what does white anti-racist activism look like in the Gulf South? I've identified two different themes here, sub-themes really. First and foremost, one that speaks to the motivations of these individuals and the ways that they see themselves in relation to the activism that they're involved with. And then also the actual work of it. In what ways are they involved at present as white anti-racist activists? So we'll begin first with Paul's sort of take on motivations, and then continue with Ryan's offering of his work, his current work as a white anti-racist activist.
So much of the talk about social justice today is in terms of altruism. You have to help these people. That's not where I came from. I told you, my father said, if we don't organize everybody, Black people included, we're going to get fucked. You got to organize everybody. That means to help them. So if you ask a lot of white kids, and I'm talking about the 60s from the North, why did you go south? They would talk in terms of helping people. They would say something like, in grade school, I was taught that America is the land of opportunity and we're all equal. Then I saw on television Bull Connor turning the fire hoses on, Black people, and I was shocked. So I came south to help Black people and to make America into what it should be. See, I wasn't shocked when I saw that. I knew that's the way America was, and I came south not exactly to help Black people, but to help the country, because the country at that time, I know this is hard to believe, were being run by a bunch of reactionary racists in the 60s. And the reason that it was being run by reactionary racists was because they kept getting reelected. And the reason they kept getting reelected was because many of their constituents, in some cases, the majority of their constituents, could not vote. So if Blacks gained the power to vote, they would vote these sons of bitches out. And those were the people that were taking apart the New Deal for which my parents fought. They were ruining everything that my parents fought for. So I didn't come down exactly to help anybody. They were doing perfectly well without me, I can tell you. But I did come down to fight for myself, to make a better world. And we knew that every advancement that was made in this country was pushed for in the majority by the Black community. Even the union movement, which was primarily white, which was racist, didn't make real advances until Blacks pushed their way into that. Then the union movement became progressive.
So we see there Paul's take on motivations, right? Why do white anti-racist activists become involved? And he talks about this binary of, helping people or rejecting that, and sort of this idea of altruism, and really thinking about it in terms of being a support mechanism, but doing it not for very self-serving reasons, right? For the work that his parents did in previous iterations of activism, and for all the sort of the progress that had been made up until that point politically, rather than for altruism, as I said. Next, we see Ryan sort of talk about the ways in which white anti-racist activism manifests itself even today in the Gulf South.
Most of my adult life, I've considered myself an active anti-racist activist, and have worked in all of the various areas that leads one to work in. But I mean, I have to confess, I'm one of Eric Hoffer's last of the true believers, because there were very few progressive issues that I'm not involved with some way or the other. Most recently, we organized a Ukraine vigil, and when I say that we did this, we did it in Oxford, Mississippi, which is the home of Ole Miss, not New Miss, and we organized a Ukraine vigil. We had a big rally for gun control following the Uvalde massacres. We recently had a sizable rally, a couple hundred people, which is pretty big for a small town after the Roe decision. So we've got visions of a different kind of society we'd like to see. So we end up in some kind of confrontation or resistance to all the forces that work against those visions and those hopes that we have. So,
Okay. With that understanding of motivation, of sort of the ways in which white anti-racist activism expresses itself in the Gulf South as examples, the next theme pertains to the personal impacts of that activism on the individual that's involved, right? And this pattern code that sort of emerges is a binary of families being supportive and families, not being so supportive of the individuals who are involved in this activism. So for the first two, I provided here examples of both support and instability as expressed by Paul and Ryan in different ways. The first example being support by his parents when he was younger, and he was active in a variety of social justice movements, mostly in the labor movement in the South.
So I told my parents that the FBI supported what we were doing, which was technically correct because we're doing voter registration work. So all they knew about the fear is the FBI. They didn't understand Southern sheriffs. So I came down. Then I got arrested. This was in Southwest Georgia, first time I was arrested. And I didn't want my parents to know. These are, people that set me down. Really, it was from them. Now they would find out what I'm up to. So I had one phone call. So I called a girlfriend of mine in Chicago because I didn't want to call my parents or a lawyer or anything that they would find out about. Except that my girlfriend in Chicago spoke to her girlfriend in Philadelphia that night. And this girlfriend in Philadelphia, her parents, played bridge that night with my parents. And they said, "Isn't it terrible what happened to Larry?" And my parents said, "What are you talking about?" Then they freaked out. For one thing, they called the sheriff this is in Southwest Georgia. Now, these Southern sheriffs, I don't think ever dealt with a Jewish mother directly, and they called our congressmen and senators, who then called the sheriff. This poor little sheriff didn't know what hit him. Get me in jail, didn't do much good. But that's when I told my parents that, I'm down here because of you. And that's when they had to come to grips with the danger. And at first they freaked out, but then they became very active in Friends of SNCC in Philadelphia and were red-baited on the radio because of that. They were called out in Philadelphia, which they were kind of used to. See, the whole communism was sort of intellectual. It wasn't really about much. Really, what they did is sit around, sing songs. My father helped organize a union, but it wasn't a communist union. It was just a regular business union.
And in addition to the ways in which, he was supported by his parents in his younger years, he also offers, a brief sort of assessment of instability in his own family after post-marriage with children.
Well, I've been divorced 3 times, and I'm on my 4th. Not exactly marriage, but I call it marriage because that's really what it is. So a criteria for getting together with me had to be that they were involved in one level or the other. But so, they always supported what I was doing. But, after 3 marriages, I have been told it's you. it's not them, it's you. It was me, after 3 times. And so I was never very good at, family and marriages, because all I knew about was the movement. And I shortchanged my kids until, say, 10 years ago, when I got to know them better and apologize for not being there, because I was always, doing movement stuff. And I lost 3 wives, not 100% for that, but it played a large role that I was myself in the movement. This relationship stuff is harder. They can shoot me and beat me up, but don't look at me like that. It's your look. I can't deal with that. I'm going to south where all they do is shoot.
Okay, so there we see the real impacts of being, deeply involved in this type of activism, and sort of the toll it takes on the family unit. Similarly, Ryan expresses, from a different angle, family instability because of his ideological views and his activism, and very much that was opposed still to the white supremacist views that his family members held.
In our extended family, which revolved around my maternal grandmother and grandfather primarily, we had very, very deep blood family ties and relationships. I had been somewhat of a contrarian on other things as a high school student. And, so they were used to occasional deviations from the party line. But essentially what we did was we reached an agreement that we just simply wouldn't talk about religion and politics, in order that we could keep civil family relationships, because I was unrelenting. I mean, my position was, if they chose to reject me over that, so be it. My path was laid. My commitment was such that I wouldn't have been deterred. But basically, we worked out a relationship that might not have had a whole lot of integrity in some ways, but at least made it possible for us to sustain family relationships. It was just sort of a consensus agreement. I wouldn't say there was any enforcement at all. It's hard for me to really remember how all that went. I'm sure I made political points that they probably didn't agree with and so on. I can't recall. I mean, they were not going to confront me with any overt racism, because they wanted to keep the relationship, and I wanted to keep the relationship. So they weren't going to provoke me, and I did not see them as a mission field that I was there to preach to. I agreed to the deal myself. I mean, this was mostly unspoken, but I agreed myself that we just won't talk about this in order to sustain some measure.
A point I wanted to make about this particular sub-theme is that in all 5 interviews, it emerged in some way when it came to either close family or extended family, and this silencing of the political debate in the home was common, is common so far in all of these interviews. The next major theme has to do with the narrator's understanding of the differences, similarities between whiteness and white supremacy, and sort of sub-themes. I think Paul provides a good, definition of sorts that separates one from the other. And Ryan speaks to the social construction of these two identities and also ideologies. So we'll begin with sort of Paul's take on defining them.
Yeah, whiteness is that. Hello, I'm white, But white supremacy is God has endowed whites, first of all, to look like God. We know God is white, and Jesus Christ has to be white. And we were put on this earth to be the shepherds of the earth. And among those people that we are responsible for are the lower races, like blacks. And we're responsible for them. We take good care of them. They're happy here. I didn't say it the whole way they used to say it because I can't. I mean, I literally can't. I just can't bring myself to do it. But white supremacy is the certainty that you were put on earth to run it, to rule it. And for good reason, because, you're smarter and whatever than anybody else. But it's also a belief that it's okay to exploit Black people because they were put on this earth, to work for you. There's an overlap. I mean, nobody that believes in white supremacy doesn't also say, hello, I'm white. It's a funny thing. Everybody that has a belief that there's a group that's superior in the world, just by dumb coincidence, happens to be their group.
So here, I think this particular take and the ways that Paul thinks through whiteness and white supremacy, I think it reflects a lot of the scholarship that's out there, frankly. But in addition, I think it draws a very clear line between the two and cultivates sort of this common space that they share, right? And when he says, anyone who's white supremacist is not white, or at least doesn't identify as that on some level. But I think overall, in listening to his take on it, I find a lot of common ground with the ways that my research has developed and sort of understanding the stark differences between whiteness and what in my research I call white supremacist whiteness as ideologies and identities. I sort of see those two as being completely separate identities, both socially constructed, but in their elements, sort of being separate and different because of the ways in which they approach social justice, right? White supremacist whiteness completely rejecting it, whereas whiteness, sort of embracing it. And yeah, the common ground there would be a person's white skin, their identification with whiteness on some level, but definitely there being a stark difference. And I think sort of Paul does a good job of bringing that to light in his rendition of the definition. So let's listen in now on Ryan and the way that he positions both of these as social constructs.
At one level, of course, both whiteness and blackness are social constructs that we've invented to support inequities that we're fond of. So whiteness is a culture. So it's a way of life. It has to be realized, and white people have to realize how it conveys complicity upon you as in the form of various forms of privilege that we have to find ways to consciously renounce and to seek rebalancing mechanisms within culture and politics to make change. White supremacy is a conscious belief that white people are superior to people of color, based purely on skin color, and maybe some kind of notion of historical accomplishment. But so technically, it's a conscious belief, and perhaps the articulation or teaching of that view. But that view has resulted in such powerful cultural practices that the difference between a person technically committed to intellectual white superiority and a person who may not have that same level of intellectual consciousness in terms of the practices that they engage in behaviorally in the culture, there's really not much difference. So when you say the white supremacist culture, essentially, you're talking about all white people who are socialized. And you say all, there might be an exception. All of us who have a white skin culture are acculturated and socialized into white ways of thinking and to white expectations and to those white expectations and practices representing the normal, the defining normal, into which other people may or may not be included, both socially and in terms of political empowerment.
So here we hear Ryan speak to this hegemonic sort of white supremacist culture that's been dominant throughout U.S. history. He sort of touches upon that and is continues to dominate at present. And he sets that again, just like Paul, sort of in relation to whiteness, but separate from it, right? And he even goes as far as to mention, well, there's some whites don't identify as this, and I think that speaks to some of the scholarship that's out there that presents this white supremacist ideology as being dominant throughout U.S. history and at present. Not to say that there isn't a large contingency also of individuals who self-identify as white or can be externally categorized as white, who oppose it and have opposed it throughout history, not just at present, but throughout history. Okay. So the last theme here for this pilot project, related to one of the questions again, is advice for future white anti-racist activists. This is taken directly from the question, and trying to see the ways in which this generation of white anti-racist activists could offer information for future generations. So the major sub-theme so far is what I've titled here as persuading white liberals. There hasn't been any discussion of like white supremacists or trying to find ways to make inroads into into white supremacist culture. For the most part, everyone that we've interviewed sees that as a no-go, right? And again, that's also reflective of the scholarship. It's hard to change a person's view who sort of has that level of aversion for a fellow human being. So with that last, and this is a rendition and an offering from Ryan's take on it, we'll close the themes of the pilot project.
Where you engage that is with white people who do not consider themselves white supremacists and who view themselves one way or the other as favorable toward racial progress, as most white liberals do, whether they're doing anything about it or not. Black comedian Dick Gregory used to say a white liberal is a person who will hang you from a low limb. And I am really engaged in this more now than I have historically, trying to find ways to deal with folks who think of themselves as really well-intentioned, good folks who are completely revolted by the idea that anybody would think they were racist, and mostly probably revolted by the idea that anybody would think they had white privilege, which is the hurdle that you have to get over with white liberals to get to the point where you can begin to make any progress with them on the issues. But that's where you engage it. You don't engage it with conscious white supremacists. I'm not one who thinks there's a hell of a lot to be engaged by shouting across the field at Klans people, but I do it from time to time. That's not my idea of how we make social change, but that's my interaction with white supremacists. When I ran the Hunger Coalition in Mississippi, I got threatening calls from Nazis and Klans people all the time. It was just part of it. Now I would engage them, and I just say, you guys, y'all are not wrong about needing to take the country back. I said, y'all just try and take it back from the wrong people. Y'all are trying to take back people who don't run it. I said, there are some folks up there who own the country that we need to be working on, but y'all are not in the right fight. But that was all fun and games. They weren't going. I wasn't trying to persuade them of anything. I was just playing with them. Don't waste any of your life and energy fighting the Civil War. That fight's over. I said, don't fight the Civil War. Don't spend your time and energy worrying about who somebody's going to love because of their sexual identity. let's all find a way to make this society flourish for everybody together. And depending on where it goes, you can get into to dismantling racism kinds of talks, and you can advise them, be willing to listen to what Black and oppressed people and people oppressed in various ways in our society are saying, even when it's uncomfortable. Learn from them, because if we care about humanity and we care about the what we have euphemistically called the common good, we need to listen to the people that are hurting, find out why they're hurting, and find out what we can do to unhurt, to create unhurt in those situations, so that we can be mutually enriching and mutually flourish in the society we're trying to build.
So here we sort of see the importance of class coming to the discussion. Ryan introduces it and sort of shows that's salient as well. The differences in wealth and income inequality, and ultimately, offering the future generation advice so as to lead them in a direction that brings about the change that his generation, that Ryan's generation was interested in accomplishing. And I will say that this is a common theme so far in the interviews that we've done. As far as conclusions, we've identified at least some major themes at this point, and sub themes associated with them. So in sort of the origins of the individuals and how those origins guided them in their own activism, whether it was as antagonistic to their family units or supported by them. We saw the ways in which white anti-racist activism manifests itself at present, and sort of the motivations behind white anti-racist activists in the Gulf South. Like, why do they do what they do, or what, at least a take on why they should do what they're doing, right? And then views on the differences between whiteness and white supremacy as well were articulated, as we saw. And finally, some advice for the next generation. These are, we're hoping to build off of these interviews in upcoming iterations, and sort of add questions and modify questions as well, depending on what other themes emerge. But the work sort of continues. And I say that because, as part of this grant, one of the stipulations is to create online presentations from these themes. And we've done one so far. So there's an additional 4 that we're going to be working on to complete. There's also a short documentary in the works that we hope to publish on our website through the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. And then finally, this summer, I'm going to be working on a grant and sort of seeking collaborators to work on a grant that will expand this work further, sort of provide us with equipment, with manpower, and woman power, and otherwise to get folks out there to interview other self-identifying white anti-racist activists, at the next phase, it'll be confined sort of to Florida. That's what we hope to do with this grant. But eventually, what we want to try to do is expand this project beyond, both in the size of the geographic size that it covers, but then also the intersectional nature of the project. So, we have some questions that speak to gender, for example, to inequalities faced by the LGBTQ plus community, and we're hoping to sort of expand that aspect of the work. Classism as well. We're hoping to add to that aspect of the work that we're doing as part of this project, and sort of the intersectionalities between those 3 elements of identity. So that is going to be part of the next phase of the project, and the grant that we're going to be working on over the summer. So with that, I'd like to close and offer the floor for questions. Thank you all for coming and for listening to this introduction to the project. And it is an open floor if you'd like to just, unmute and ask, or type your question in the chat.
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. I'm really, it was very engaging and your research is fascinating. I was interested in intersections between the white anti-racists that you were speaking with, and how their Jewish identity. I know of at least one of them that spoke, how that may be intersected with their own ideologies and how they identify themselves as white anti-racists.
Yeah, so the gentleman codenamed Paul here, he speaks to this in his interview. He talks about sort of his Jewish background and how that played a role. He grew up in Philadelphia, and his parents were born there, and they sort of grew into this social justice activist culture with the socialist sort of circles in Philadelphia in the early 20th century, and then beyond with the local chapters of the Communist Party. But as he mentioned, it was about labor, right? And it was about labor activism, and that's the way that they saw it. So for them, in his interview, he talks about being his parents being persecuted as communists, for example, during McCarthyism, and how that impacted him as a child, and how he learned to have a critical view of the government and government institutions, especially the executive branch and the FBI more specifically. And it really led him into the space that he sort of filled later in his life, and he's very clear about that in his interview. So yeah, there is that layer of intersectionality between sort of that identity, the Jewish identity, as an activist identity, and whiteness as he described it, being just an external characteristic. As he said, hey, hello, I'm white, but and then also drawing a distinction between that and white supremacy. So there does, in his mind, and I'm sure probably future iterations, if we interview more people, would probably find that again and again, because we know in the scholarship, there is a well studied sort of scholarly vein about Jewish American activism in the early 20th century and beyond. So he's voicing sort of and he's accentuating that aspect of history and sort of that experience.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I think it really makes sense, and the connections with also that so many Jews that were migrants themselves coming from Eastern Europe, and because they were persecuted because of the pogroms that they faced in Russia and in other parts of Europe.
Yeah, of course, I think Karen Brodkin speaks to also the within the community there being sort of animosities between Western European Jews and Eastern European Jews in the U.S. context. So yeah, and of course like you very well stated, their activism, the activism that resulted from their experiences in the United States, I think was critical in the early 20th century, according to all the scholarship that's out there. It's well studied, and sort of I have an appreciation for it, certainly too, an understanding of it, but also an appreciation for it, because it's a space that they filled that needed to be filled, at the time.
Yiorgo, if I could jump in, I wanted to congratulate you on your research. Even though, as you mentioned, it's at the initial stages, it's very exciting. And, I think that especially now with activism really hopefully on the rise, we see a lot of different movement campaigns, Starbucks workers, Black Lives Matter, immigrant activism in the South. I think what you're doing is really going to be especially helpful to organizers. And I was reminded about this, and I actually deferred to you on this. I received a call from someone who's from a white anti-racist organization who wants their organization, I think typically is active in the Upper South, and they want to get involved in the Deep South. And so I said, well, you need to talk to Yiorgo. He's doing some great work. And I guess, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, when I'm listening to these great narratives, I'm thinking of this, these older generations, I think of people like Ann Braden or Howard Zinn or Stott Lind, and, they talked very eloquently about how they were raised, some of them within Jewish labor traditions, or even multi-generational, African-American activists. I think in my own background in the Chicano movement, there's a intergenerational, like there's movement elders that you kind of learn from. I think about people, I'm thinking now in Florida, I'm thinking of like Stetson Kennedy. And then also I've been recently rereading Carrie McWilliams, and I think of them, I don't think either of them, I mean, Stetson maybe because he lived longer, but I don't think either of them necessarily define themselves as white anti-racist activists. They were white people, they self-define as white, who were just really, kind of basically, no holds barred, organizers and activists. And what's interesting in thinking about your work is how Harry Williams and Stetson Kennedy really, in some ways, I'm not even sure if they knew each other, but they both kind of cohered around labor activism. And I wonder if you could talk about the role of labor and economic justice in kind of pushing people to become active, because it seems like that's an emerging theme in your work. I'm not sure, but it seems to me, listening to the narratives, that labor and economic justice is. Could you comment on that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think of the two, Paul certainly emphasized it more. His like I said, his parents, his family members were involved in sort of the socialist labor movement in and around Philadelphia, and certainly spoke to that in his interview. It definitely is a catalyst, right, in the early 20th century and beyond, and at present, of course, right. The socioeconomic impetus is what drives at least a portion of the protests, the political activism that we see today, and we've seen in the past. And that's why I think it's so important for this project to sort of move in that direction as well, in the upcoming months, and in the next year, certainly, as we continue, is to start emphasizing that as well, and some of the questions that we bring up. So the questionnaire, and the way it exists right now, is more generalized and open to, absorbing as much information as is out there. But yeah, I think it is a very important component of this type of activism, and something that like I said, is a catalyst and has driven in the past protests and political movements, and continues to today. So there's also a question in the chat by Hugo C. Some people in the white Hispanic community share similar themes among white supremacy, but are socially excluded from these white supremacist groups in the U.S. Will your research include these population groups who also support anti-racism? So the idea here is like whiteness as an identity, right? And I think that comes through in these interviews, that the excerpts that we presented as an identity, but also as an ideology. Yeah. So white skin, and this is also in the scholarship, right? White skin is one of those criteria, but it isn't the sole criteria, right? It's also adhering to these ideological elements of what whiteness is, right? And if we can position whiteness, as I like to, as sort of the opposite of white supremacy, right? Then there definitely is a space within that ideological whiteness to talk about any group that sort of identifies with the elements of that ideology that pertain to empathy and social justice activism, and equity and equality in society. So yeah, the answer is yes. And sort of looking at, groups that are adhering to the ideological elements of whiteness and rejecting ideological elements of white supremacist whiteness. That is an interest of mine, of my own research.
I want to draw a little more, Yiorgo, because you and I have had some of these conversations. I'm going to try to see if I can understand the distinctions that you're making between whiteness and white supremacy. And so, if someone in my work as an organizer, mainly in the Southeast, but even in the Northwest, I, as a labor organizer, I've worked with people, and I'm actually now a union president for, kind of a small, medium-sized union chapter of about 900 members. And, some of our members talk about learning how to become anti-racists. And often, and I'm talking about the white members or even other white labor unionists that I've known throughout my career in the labor movement. And some of them talk about, they've created a narrative which I can recognize I'm hearing in some of your narrators. And part of the narrative that they create as white people becoming anti-racist is they'll talk about the oppression their family faced as white people. They don't try to kind of paper these things over. And they'll say that, well, my mother worked in a donut shop and she was sexually harassed and, terribly abused by her boss, or a person, grew up in a sharecropping family in the South. And, I'm still old enough to know people, at least whose parents were sharecroppers or tenant farmers in the Southeast. And so again, there's kind of a class narrative, I think, that, and I'm just kind of asking you, you don't have to agree, but I'm just kind of grappling with this. It seems like some white individuals who become anti-racist, and now I'm not talking about people who kind of grew up in a tradition of struggle, because we've been talking so far about, we have interviewed individuals who grew up in, Yiddish labor councils in Chicago or New York, or they grew up in socialist families in Milwaukee, or, and so there's this multi-generational narratives of, fighting the system or being anti-capitalist. I'm thinking now of people who didn't grow up with those traditions, but who are white, but who kind of somehow get shocked into, that's not a good term, but, kind of oppressed into becoming anti-racist. But then I'm also thinking about the people that don't, the people that go the other way, and I guess that's really the question I have is, have you, within your theoretical framework, have you thought about this question of choice? And so you have, like, say, a son or daughter of white tenant farmers that got really badly screwed over by their landlord. And in one case, it leads them to join in solidarity, with Mexican or Black, sharecroppers. But then the other case where they just say, well, to heck with it, I'm going to find out what it takes to move up the ladder and become a white oppressor or what have you. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does, Paul. And I sort of, I see this as a continuum. And when I say this, I mean like the relationship between whiteness and white supremacist whiteness. And if we could sort of imagine like two poles of that continuum, where you have, you're, on one end, your Christian nationalist KKK members, on that extreme. And then on the other side, you have individuals who are active in anti-racist, anti-classist, homophobic movements, and intersections of all of those as well. And sort of you're talking about a space in the middle now, right? And I think that space in the middle comes with some privilege, because if you can, identify externally as white and pass as white, or you're externally categorized as white, you have that privilege of choice that other people don't, right? And I'm sort of speaking from personal experience too, because that's the way my whole life I've been identified. I've been identified as white, and yet, you bring up this good point about, in the past, folks like myself and some of the people we interviewed will look to the past and say, well, my mother was sexually harassed, by her boss. So I have that knowledge of that, of that harassment, of that oppression, right? And they use that, to sort of make a decision to become social activists, anti-racist, but in many ways like intersectional and anti-racist activists. So race being one component, and then class and gender being the other two. And I think that that's a privilege to be able to make that decision, right? It's not open to anyone to be able to do that, because of their external appearance. So for those folks that can pass, right, historically, we have plenty of examples where they make the decision to become the oppressor. You're right. And that's sort of what my research speaks to. It speaks to like that decision-making moment, right? Which is steeped in silence sometimes. Like it's just, as we saw in Ryan's case, they're not talking about it in his home. There's no discussions being had. There's sort of this unspoken rule, that we're not going to talk about politics in here. And they both sides know not to do it because they know that the outcome is not going to lead anywhere for anyone, right? But I argue in my work that silence is an opportunity. It's not just complicity. It is complicity too. It can become complicity if the individual doesn't do anything, right? Or if the individual makes the conscious decision to sort of assimilate into that hegemonic white supremacist culture, right? And that white supremacist ideology. But that silence could also be a jumping off point for moving in the direction of the other side of the continuum. And choosing through that privilege, choosing to become like the abolitionists of the 19th century, the labor activists in the early 20th century, the labor and race and civil rights activists of the mid 20th century, and even all the way until today. So, I see silence as an opportunity too, not just, a point where people become complicit. They have the privilege to make that decision. My work argues that they should cash it in. Any other questions from anyone? Yeah, I agree, Hugo. Yeah, it's an important sort of moment, right? Silence is this moment that and we see it in scholarship that's out there already. How silence is treated by scholars for the most part, like I said, as complicity. I think there's another component to it too. So yeah, I am with you on this. It's an opportunity to understand. And so in a lot of the work that we've done so far, we see that past. We see the individuals use that past, right, of that social activist past, or try to distance themselves from, a past that is linked to white supremacist whiteness. And that's the case with Ryan. He doesn't identify with his family members because of their strict and stringent understandings of what it means to be a white person in this atmosphere, in this country. the rightful position of the white man as being dominant, and he is in complete antagonism with that. He remained silent for all of his life, in his home, but that sort of motivated him into that direction, into that part of the spectrum, as I see it, where he approaches whiteness as it should be, whiteness that is empathetic, whiteness that is social justice oriented, not white supremacist. Thank you. Thank you so much. If there are no other questions or comments, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, of course, for giving me the opportunity to do this work, and the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere for supporting this work financially so we could acquire some of the equipment we acquired and do this work. And I'm very excited about it. I think there's a promise here for a space for individuals who self-identify or can be externally categorized as white, that puts them in relief from white supremacist whiteness. These folks have nothing to do with white supremacist whiteness. They are different, and I think that there should be a space for their ideas. There should be a space for their voice, and it should be identified as the whiteness that they really represent. And they also have a historical pedigree of activism, going all the way back to, as Ibram Kendi has shown, the abolitionist movement, all the way to the present. The Anne Brandon that Dr. Ortiz mentioned. There's countless individuals, that I have in mind that are just great examples for white folks to hold up and valorize, as what whiteness really means, instead of having to make excuses for the individuals that we currently hold up as examples. There's a difference between those two sort of spaces, and I think there more and more discussion needs to be had about what whiteness really is and what it really represents versus what has become hegemonic in U.S. society, and that is the white supremacist whiteness ideology and identity. Yes.
So one shameless promotion for the Florida Historical Society, our press, apropos of your excellent work, Yiorgo, we're actually publishing a new collection of Stetson Kennedy's essays. And these are essays that have not before been published or put together in one volume. And I think it's going to be exciting, especially for those of us who are interested in this topic of white anti-racism. It's coming out later in the spring, and so you can just look at the Florida Historical Society press site. What's amazing about it is there's so many things in your research that really jive with Stetson's experiences in terms of, he actually had to react against his family tradition. He had a lot of members active in the Ku Klux Klan. But one of the things that really struck me, I'm actually writing the foreword for this publication. And the thing that struck me about, I'm trying to think about the same thing. And so I'm really, I've learned so much from your research, because I've been trying to figure out myself, what differentiates Stetson Kennedy from so many of the people around him. And one of the things was that because he was an oral historian and a folklorist, he gained a tremendous insight into, Black and Cuban and kind of non-white cultures, especially working cultures, because, he interviewed and talked with people who were, turpentine workers, phosphate miners, and even with poor whites, he gained a tremendous, respect. And so in some ways, being a folklorist and a researcher and a labor activist too, because he was active, he did do some work with Operation Dixie with the CIO after World War II. I mean, those are things that just help keep him real grounded. Plus the fact he worked with Zora Neale Hurston, and Hurston didn't take any nonsense from no white man. And so, you know, he was always around people who just helped him stay grounded in these kind of anti-authoritarian traditions. So yeah, anyway, those just some, you know, kind of follow-up thoughts. And I think your work helps us kind of situate better and think, you know, about people like, you know, Ann Braden or, you know, Stetson or Carrie McWilliams, you know, people who sometimes get short shrift in, you know, in the literature and the telling, but, you know, they're certainly part of these important radical, you know, dissenting traditions.
No, yeah, you're absolutely. I'm looking forward to that collection, and you're absolutely right about that. One of the things that didn't come across in this presentation, but is in some of the interviews, is you know, but people who aren't necessarily, you know, as radical as, let's say, Paul, you know, who we highlighted in this presentation, or Ryan. You know, they're sort of participants, right? They're vocal, right? They identify with, you know, a social justice activist sort of version of whiteness, but they, you know, they haven't like negotiated their family space, let's say. In fact, they've cultivated it in their family, and there's like more. There's family units that, you know, support it, and they've played a role in that with their children, with their grandchildren. So, but they won't necessarily like, you know, lead union marches. They'll be in the union march, right? They're sort of the foot soldiers, right? They're the people that take up the space and, you know, yell the loudest, and they're not necessarily leaders, but they're just as important. And that's another sort of experience that, you know, in these 5 interviews has emerged as a theme that I'm hoping to bring to light in upcoming iterations of this project. All right. Any other questions or comments before we conclude? Okay. Well, thank you all for, you know, being in the audience today. I truly appreciate you coming, taking time out of a Friday afternoon to be here, you know. And I hope we can continue this conversation. Feel free to contact me. I did post the website. Let me post the website real quick of the project. That's here if you're interested in following the project. And as you saw, there's next steps in line. You know, a couple more of these stories will be posted on our website, as well as a short documentary in the works, and then continued work in acquiring more interviews. So there's more to come. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Take care now.